Well, thank you, Rich. As he alluded to, I'm going to take us maybe in just a little bit different direction from some of the other presentations today. And with that, let's get my buttons. This slide is really kind of one of those preaching to the choir slide. I think everyone in the room probably knows all of this a lot better than I do. But I do want to focus on a couple of aspects of ATSC 3 for us. This interactive applications side of this, I think we've heard a lot about that today. An example is some of the enhanced emergency alerting type features. Of course, I'm from the public broadcasting world, and I see this as opportunities also in interactive learning games such as exist today associated with the programming on the PBS Kids channel, but integrating that into the broadcast content opens up, a lot of possibilities that's out there. So again, and obviously commercial applications on and on. Fred mentioned a little bit about targeted advertising and that sort of thing earlier today. We heard from some work at Michigan State about pre-positioning content in this new magical box that we're likely all to have. But again, the key to this interactivity is, of course, the return data path and also the use of IP, or the Internet Protocol, as the transport mechanism. That again enables a lot of these applications. The use of IP, and particularly this return data path, also sort of brings out the tinfoil hat crowd, okay? That what are we doing here? Well, we'll try to maybe put things into perspective a little bit. So why should a broadcaster be concerned about cybersecurity related issues? And I think there's kind of two reasons that come into play. First, if you think about our broadcast plant and really think about that ATSC environment, I think about one of the diagrams that Fred used of his STL network in Dallas. It's all data circuits. I didn't see, it's a data network interconnecting those. And of course, our plants are all becoming, if they haven't already, an IT environment all based on IP. So this familiarity sort of opens this door that hadn't really been there in the past. Yes, we've had networks in our broadcast plants for many, many years, but most of the time that Ethernet jack on some piece of broadcast equipment really was used for what? Control, for monitoring type things. And what? That BNC connector with the serial digital or maybe an ASI stream was where the content is. And of course that is moving away. And then finally we have the contempt issue that whether you're commercial or non-commercial, there can be, people that like your programming, maybe they don't like your programming. We hear a lot about fake news and so forth. So in some ways, I don't want to say we now have a target on our backs, but there is a target out there, and that target may be getting bigger for us. So why do we really worry about it? Well, if we look at some of the incidents that's happened in the industry, the KQED ransomware has probably been the highest profile event in the broadcast world that has occurred. There's been a lot of smaller incidents, particularly with radio stations having the normal programming becoming hijacked and alternative programming put on the air. And of course, we all hear about the famous barracks boxes and the problems with those and IP-based STLs and so forth. And then probably the biggie, at least in the US, was the Sony hack, which basically ended up re-releasing a major movie. So if we look at some of the risks, certainly I think from a broadcast statement or station, dead air is something everyone works really, really hard to avoid. And there again can be other impacts. You're known for a certain type of programming. When that alternative programming is substituted, well, there's some embarrassment in a lot of cases. There can be loss of this public trust, and again, the list goes on and on. But again, if we look back in broadcasting, kind of the history, particularly going back to the 80s, there's not really, this is not anything new. Max Headroom became pretty popular back in, the early 80s, when an STL path of a station was overridden. And not too long after that, of course, Captain Midnight came along, where in this particular case, a satellite transponder was overridden. And if you think about these two events, yes, it took certainly some technical knowledge, took technical knowledge of that broadcast infrastructure, which at the time was really pretty specialized equipment. And particularly in the case of the STL path, that equipment had to be, precisely in the right place. And in the case of, let's say, a satellite transponder, yes, it could be located virtually anywhere of the footprint of the station. But back in the day, you probably didn't move too many 10-meter satellite dishes around very easy. So again, it took some pretty specialized stuff. Now, of course, today we can wreak a lot more havoc with a notebook computer enjoying our favorite beverage. So there's our challenges that we have for us. So when we talk about cybersecurity, there's kind of three foundational characteristics that we want to provide: confidentiality, data integrity, and resource availability. And those three together form what is referred to as the CIA triad. Now, the CIA triad does not have anything to do with one particular governmental agency that is kind of down the road, yes. So you might also run across this referred to as the AIC triad, simply to avoid that confusion. Again, the key is to, these three attributes that all of cybersecurity is based around, these kind of three foundational attributes. And we'll see more of this in a couple more slides. So everyone has a secure IT system, whether it's your station, whether it's your home network or whatever, right? No one here will admit that their system is not secure, right? But what really does that mean? Well, there's not really one attribute or one characteristic that makes a system secure. Actually, it's a whole bunch of things together. One of those, believe it or not, starts with a security policy. And you think, well, wait a minute, there's more to it than just having a plan or a policy. Well, this again is your starting place. It's a roadmap. And probably one of the most important aspects of a security policy is having an inventory of your IT assets. That can certainly be a desktop computer can be an asset, a server is an asset, but also information or data contained within those devices. So having that accurate inventory and then carefully looking at the risk involved and maybe the value of those assets, you develop that plan of how to secure or how to protect those. Certainly, we want to comply with those CIA triad objectives. Again, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And you also want to have a layered or segmented network design. In other words, all your host devices are not on one network. You separate them or segment them, however, in functional areas so that, yes, you may use a common physical infrastructure, but through the use such as VLANs, for instance, you would segment those networks such that if there was a breach of a network, you haven't gained access to all of the assets of the organization. And we'll look at an example of that in a couple of slides. Of course, you're going to limit access to those systems, kind of adopt this need to access type mindset. Certainly be careful with, granting privileged users. That is a user that virtually has access to everything in terms of an asset. And again, this mindset of denying by default. Access we want to control. We can restrict access by things like access control lists, firewalls, proxies. We encrypt things through VPNs. So again, some characteristics. One of the most often forgotten area is an active support and a monitoring scheme. In other words, knowing what is normal for your network infrastructure. We heard this morning from Paul Schulens about all of the great things you can monitor at our transmitter sites that we're used to doing, from temperatures to powers to efficiencies, but kind of apply that same rationale to your IT environment. Know what is normal, because a lot of times when something is out of that tolerance range or normal, and there's not a business case, let's say, to justify why do I have this increased traffic, that also might very well mean there's been some type of cyber event that has occurred. So again, this monitoring is really important. We've talked certainly a lot about ATSC and the standards today. Again, this IP integration now brings a couple of more organizations into play in terms of standards. The IEEE, of course, we're all very familiar with, although you might not be aware of the Project 802 that the IEEE is responsible to manage the Ethernet standards, which is the foundation of our networks today. And of course the IETF, or the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the often considered the Bible of the Internet. What that's really saying, they're the keeper of the IP, or the Internet Protocol standards. And all of their standards are referenced by an RFC. In fact, in some presentations earlier today, we've seen several RFCs that have been quoted. One of the important things I think to keep in mind about the IETF RFCs is these levels of implementation. The required implementation level, well, that's pretty self-explanatory, but the recommended and the elective level sometimes gets into trouble. And particularly when you have interoperability issues between devices. I think we heard earlier where, well, it just didn't all work. It should work when I plug this Ethernet connector into this box, but it doesn't. And that's where you get into some of the problems and so forth. If we look at network models, and engineers love reference models, it gives us sort of a guide book. We have the OSI model. A lot of people refer to this as a legacy model that's really not appropriate anymore, but I think it's very appropriate because the language of networking comes from the OSI model that is still used today. Now, as networking has advanced some and this Ethernet-based IP network has sort of become the ubiquitous standard, we have a couple of other models that have come along, namely the TCP/IP model, as well as then its companion DoD model, which are very similar, but of course, this is the government, so we got to tweak and change a few things, okay? And now we're going to, again, remember one of our advantages of ATSC 3 is this integration. And of course, we have a layered model that makes up ATSC 3. And there is a common area, and that is the Internet Protocol area that we have to work with. So as you look at applications, particularly in ATSC 3, you'll find a lot, again, as we have already today, a lot of the IETF specifications and so forth referenced in that. And now I'm stuck. Uh-oh. And there we go. Okay. We'll just jump to the next slide and okay, real quickly, the Internet Protocol has been around since 1977, believe it or not. We think about IPv4 still in use today, developed or adopted in 1981. There was such thing as a version 1, 2, and 3. Those really were experimental versions, but you know, it's pretty amazing to me that still today, in the rate of change of technology, we still have the IPv4. A few years later, IPv6 came along, which of course gave a lot more address space and also was an opportunity to tweak the original design. But really the important thing to remember is that the IP protocol is a datagram delivery protocol. And if we think back to the OSI model, each of those layers, particularly the first 4 layers that are considered data flow layers, they have a specific protocol data unit associated. At layer 1, of course, we deal with bits. Layer 2, we deal with frames. In case of a network today, that's an Ethernet frame. Layer 3 deals with the network, or IP, and then finally layer 4 as a transport. And within the transport, we have typically 2 types of protocols that can be used. TCP, this is particularly when we have that return broadband connection, or UDP, which is where our broadcast type format would take up in terms of a transmitter. And when we talk about IP, we generally talk about a packet. That packet is in a simplified manner, consists of a header and some amount of payload data. And there are, of course, specifications of how large or how small that payload data can be, and thus we may get into some fragmentation, of course, then some reassembly and so forth in the process. In looking at cybersecurity, there is really a life cycle, and that is in terms of steps that happen. The first usually begins with network, often referred to as reconnaissance. That's really exploring. What we want to do is we want to find a host, because if I can find a host, I have a potential point to then, one, implement some type of exploit. I can with that, then maybe I maintain that exploit or access to that. I can install my malware, my Trojan, whatever it is. Then I move on to the next host I can discover, and I simply multiply that and thus reach success. So if we can stop this reconnaissance, then we've saved ourselves a lot of grief. So that really is a lot of a goal. So if we look at cybersecurity threats, there's all kinds of stuff that is out there today. And if we break that down, you can generally put them kind of what I think of as about 3 general categories. You have a DDoS, or a distributed denial of service attack. You have malware, with ransomware being the most popular type. And then you have these advanced persistent threats. These are the tough ones, and won't even go down that road, but these often are implemented by let's say the experts in the field. Not to quote another government agency, but the one that's over, I think, in Baltimore. They're into that business pretty well. And these are the kind of things that they're planted, but they're not necessarily implemented or come to life. So in a threat model, one of the first places is look at how do you mitigate threats? Well, you have to understand what that threat is and then simply develop a solution for. Again, we want to keep the CIA triad in mind. And there's different threat modeling depending on where you are in the ecosystem. Maybe I'm the attacker, I'm going to have a different threat model than if I'm trying to protect assets. But within that, you really look at several factors, such as the impact of that threat upon the organization, the probability of it being implemented, and then the ease of implementing. And all those factors comes up with a risk. So in the case of ATSC 3, what might be some of our risk factors? Well, these are kind of what I've come up with. There's certainly this IP integration aspect that we've seen. There's also the ATSC signaling that comes into play. And then we have the applications that we've heard a little bit about, okay? So let's look a little bit more detail. And there, in my view, we have an ecosystem that has really three parts to it. We have a broadcast station, we have a transmission system, to me that's ATSC 3, and then we have this home environment. And it's a simplified diagram of the environment. Now we can also maybe expand that, and gets a little bit more complicated with the individual boxes and so forth. But if we look at the broadcast system or that broadcast station, we can secure that environment. We are securing that today, or at least should be securing it. And we do it again by following industry best practices. We segment the networks. One of the terms you might run into is the onion network, okay? Think of an onion and the layers. Well, that core is the most secure part of that network. So maybe that's where we have our broadcast content located. Outer areas, again, as we move out to the outer layers, are less secure. One way we can also, of course, follow the OSI model, particularly those first 4 layers, which are the data flow layers. This is kind of some of the industry best practices dealing with physical control. At layer 2, we can utilize features of our managed Ethernet switches, such as port security and snooping controls. When we get up to layer 3, again, we're dealing with packets, so we can filter those packets, or we can control where those packets are able to reach. And then finally, we have encryption that comes into play. And of course, as fact, Dr. Chernock mentioned this morning, a lot of these discrete functions that was one function, one server in an IT or in an ATSC 3 system can be virtualized now. And as you start virtualizing things, and oh my goodness.
I think you've been hacked.
I've been hacked. Wow. Anyway, once things are virtualized, all right.
Just minimize that window and be better.
Oh yeah, that's right. There we go. Okay. Anyway, the cloud environment opens up the door to virtualization and so forth. And certainly, again, I think an ATSC 3 environment in the cloud, particularly when you think about some of the interactive applications, I think that's going to be a natural environment. In fact, even today, you can have a complete master control in a cloud environment, in the ATSC 1 environment. And of course, the cloud can be secured. There's, again, general practices that comes into play. And then, of course, again, always keep that CIA triad in mind. And then finally, whoever your provider is are going to have some specific practices. In this example, I'm using AWS or Amazon Web Services because they're one of the cloud service providers that have, say, a level of services geared specifically to media organizations and companies, whether it's simple content storage or actually play out, particularly play out to all of these things that are out in the marketplace. An important thing about the cloud to keep in mind, it's a shared responsibility between the provider and the user that come into play. And then we get to the transmission system. Well, inherently within ATSC 3, security was not an afterthought. It's been certainly well thought through. The common key, in the interest of time, without going into a lot of detail, the main thing to point out, notice the IETF RFC implementations. Again, this is taking the accepted IP or internet standards and implementing those within the ATSC 3 system, whether it is transport layer security or secure DNS, or the signing with security certificates, and of course DRM encryption for content protection. Now we come to the fun part, the home environment. Remember, that's the other side of that network. And of course, today we certainly have smart TVs. We saw some presentations on Tuesday with some of the applications developed for smart TVs. We have over-the-top set-top boxes today, whether it be a Roku or whatever your favorite. And then, of course, the dongles that are now, we hope, will become plentiful in the marketplace for as a pretty economical way in which to access over-the-air programming. But then we have this other device, this generically referred to as a gateway device that incorporates an ATSC 3 tuner. Likely it incorporates multiple tuners, okay? Fred mentioned little trade-offs with some of the design, but the main thing, it has tuner capabilities for off-air. It integrates the Wi-Fi access point as well as an internet router. This is where our internet integration comes in. And we have this kind of new device. We've also, it's been suggested that this device also is going to have some content storage capability to it, particularly when we're talking about pre-positioning content for things. And of course, what does this device do? Well, it lets us integrate some of these other display devices, such as an iPad, which does not have an ATSC tuner, but it can use the tuner in the gateway box, and via the Wi-Fi, you can watch your ATSC 3 content, on that type of device. And that ATSC 3 content may be coming over the air. It might be coming through the broadband internet connection. Most users or consumers really don't care. They just want their content. But this is where I think the challenge comes into play, is this area when we bring in this internet integration. And thus you have what is often referred to as the Internet of Things. It's all of these network-enabled devices. And there's really kind of two classes of IoT things. There's the industrial IoT environment, which gets into things like SCADA systems and all of that myriad of stuff. But I'm really referring more to the home consumer IoT environment. The reality is those devices have minimal, if any, security capability at all. If you remember, a couple of years ago, the internet was virtually taken down for a day due to a massive distributed denial of service attack that was based upon a Myra malware that had several thousand. Actually, the numbers I've seen is pushing 50,000 security cameras that were infected, and they generated some 280 gigabits of traffic to the DYN, which was a DNS provider. But anyway, the reality is these IoT devices, they're high volume, minimum cost. In a lot of cases, security is an afterthought, and in too many cases, it never was a thought. But these devices can be secured. There's some, some recommendations in the way to do that, and there's even some chipsets in the trusted platform world that can be implemented to, again, put security in these devices. And again, this is just one such chipset that is available. In terms of doing again, it all goes back to that AIC triad, is protecting integrity of the data. In other words, we don't want something to be altered, or protect the confidentiality of it, or again, provide availability of the resources. Certainly there's things a homeowner can do with their network. I could hand you this list, and I'm confident everyone in this room could go implement these things in their home network. But the reality is that's not the consumer market. The consumer market, often is described as Joe Sixpack in the double wide type environment, at least in Texas, that's how it's described. So with that, as I'm about out of time, I believe, I'll leave you with a few thoughts. Again, the use of IP brings up a lot of opportunities for us, but also that use of IP makes us have to be concerned about the cybersecurity thing. In reality, ATSC 3 is simply too new to really worry about hacks. From what we've heard today, it's been a challenge just to get stuff on the air, okay? So we hadn't quite got to, the cyber hacks yet. But again, keep in mind this end-to-end system, the broadcast station, the transmission system, and that home environment. The consumer industry really needs to pay more attention to security in their products. And simply, I'll leave it with be careful out there, because the weakest link in that system, and think about the system, really is going to determine the overall end-to-end system security. And security is always this balance. It's pretty easy to make a very secure system, but it's virtually unusable. So there is a balance that comes into play. And when in doubt, of course, you can always consult Dilbert, who has usually an answer for all situations and so forth. With that, I thank you for your time this afternoon. I'll welcome questions. Although, as Fred said, boy, I hope nobody does ask me a question. And with that, though, there's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me somewhere down the road.